I know we're all stressed with life and work and relationships with friends and family, but did you know that you could have a unique type of stress or a unique stress type? After 20 years of helping patients, Dr. Doni Wilson just wrote a new book in which she has identified 5 different types of stress that people can have, and she's come up with a unique protocol for dealing with these different types of stress. So if you want to master your stress and reset your health, then make sure to check out this awesome interview. If you're interested in getting thicker, fuller, and longer hair, then make sure to check out fullyvital.com. The team has come up with a set of 100% natural and vegan products to help regrow thicker, fuller, and stronger hair. So if you're interested in hair wellness, make sure to check out fullyvital.com and use code anti-aging-hacks for 15% off. If you're enjoying this channel, then make sure to hit the subscribe button down below so you can get notified when we release new episodes. Our goal on this show is to help you look and feel younger and live your most adventurous life. So make sure to hit subscribe so you can get notified when we release the next episode. With that said, let's get right into the interview. Hello and welcome back to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Doni Wilson, who is a naturopathic doctor, a certified professional midwife, certified nutrition specialist, and the author of Master Your Stress, Reset Your Health. For more than 22 years, she has helped thousands of patients overcome health challenges and achieve wellness by using specific strategies that address the whole body and ultimately resolve the underlying causes of distress. Dr. Doni suffered from migraines for over 20 years, and in the process of solving them, she developed her stress recovery protocol. You can find her blog, podcast called How Humans Heal, and her self-care program at drdoni.com. With that said, Dr. Doni, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad to have you on and actually get deeper into a subject that's so important to all of us, namely stress, that gets thrown around a lot, but we can actually talk some specifics. We can talk hormones. We can talk about some of the negative effects that it has on the body. So I'm super excited to have you on. With that said, give us your background and how you wrote a book about stress of all things.
You know, I've been really obsessed with stress for as long as I can remember. Even when I was a child and when I was in naturopathic medical school, I went to Bastyr University in Seattle, and I studied to also be a midwife. And part of my training as a midwife, I needed to do research. And the research that I chose was about how stress affects women in labor. Because it's very common for women to be afraid of how is this baby going to come out, right? What's my experience of labor going to be like? And so I wanted to research that, especially women who have a history of abuse, emotional and physical abuse. And one of the most interesting things that came out of that research was to discover that it's actually that we need an optimal amount of stress and stress hormones in order for labor to progress effectively. If we have too much cortisol or adrenaline, or if we have too little cortisol or adrenaline, that's when labor slows down and more interventions are necessary. And so I came out of that realizing, wow, it's about having optimal cortisol and adrenaline, because a lot of us think, oh, we're supposed to be stress-free, we're supposed to decrease our cortisol, but it's more like, oh, we need an optimal amount. And then, you know what, I ended up, when I graduated and finished my residency, I ended up moving to Manhattan and opening my practice in Manhattan 2 months after 9/11 in 2001, which was again one of the most stressful times in New York history. So I was all of my patients under stress, not just pregnant patients. And so I thought to myself, well, what if I implement this same concept? Do my patients who are now recovering from stress of 9/11, do they also need optimal cortisol and adrenaline? And so that's what really set me on the path of reading and researching and writing about stress over the past 22 years.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've been reading your book and I've learned a lot from it, just reading it in the last couple of days. So I would encourage everybody to get a hold of it and read it and buy it. And so there's a ton of factors, obviously, that are very obvious to most of us that cause stress. These could be, busy lifestyles, deadlines, a coworker, boss, family members. But in your book, actually, you outline some not so obvious causes of stress, which I was surprised by. So would you list some of those out so people might have an aha moment?
For sure. Well, and sometimes it's things that we we almost consider kind of normal things like lack of sleep or travel where we're changing time zones. Even sometimes we have stress for things that are good for us, like being a parent and having a baby is a stress. Is of course having a newborn is we don't get enough sleep and it's stressful, but it's something that we want to choose, right? So it's really this concept of, hey, maybe there's stresses that we want to choose intentionally, and how do we support ourselves through that?
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, so along with diet, sleep, exercise, those are some of the key metrics, right? Or key foundational factors that we want to get right for a longevity lifestyle, which we're all about on this podcast. And stress is one of those foundational items that you got to get in place. And most people, unfortunately, don't know how, because life is just coming at us. And so what I want you to address, Dr. Doni, real quick is, what are the harmful effects of chronic stress over time, besides shortening your life? We know it shortens your life and it's not a longevity factor, but what are some of the, I guess, harmful effects inside the body and the hormonal systems or organs? What is it really doing?
Mm-hmm. And that reminds me, some of the other stresses could be from stresses that happen inside of our system, right? So the way I think about it, the way I break it down is I think about first when we have a stress response, and as humans, we have a healthy stress response, and we want a healthy stress response, right? So we have our sympathetic nervous system that's going to make adrenaline for us and help us get out of danger. But if we're constantly, like you say, under chronic stress, now we're constantly having a sympathetic and adrenaline response. And so this can itself cause symptoms of anxiety and raising blood pressure and, constantly feeling this racy, jittery feeling. And then what happens with our stress responses, we trigger what's called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So it's our brain telling our adrenal glands to make more cortisol and adrenaline, which in the moment, if you really need a stress response, is going to be helpful. But if that's happening over and over again over time because of deadlines and different things that are going on in our lives, then we're getting a constant signal to the adrenal glands. And what happens is cortisol can go too high and stay too high, or for some of us, cortisol ends up going too low. And same with adrenaline. It can either stay too high or stay too low. And either way, it's the way I systematize it based on all the research is it's affecting 4 major systems in our body. This is, I find, the easiest way to think about it is it affects our digestion. So when cortisol is thrown off and adrenaline is thrown off, we're not going to digest our food well. We're not going to absorb our nutrients well. We're not going to recover our intestinal cells well. So we end up with leaky gut. We end up with food sensitivities and inflammation throughout our bodies. We disrupt our gut bacteria. So now we're sending imbalanced signals and toxins based on the imbalanced gut bacteria. So our digestion becomes an internal stress that keeps sending more stress signals out to our bodies. The imbalanced cortisol and adrenaline also affects our immune system. So now we are more susceptible to infections, including chronic viral infections. We're more susceptible to autoimmunity and allergies and inflammation in general. The cortisol and adrenaline also increase our likelihood of imbalanced neurotransmitter levels. So neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA and dopamine. So now we're more likely to have anxiety, depression, sleep issues, fatigue. And then finally, the imbalanced cortisol affects all of our other hormones in our body. So it's going to make our insulin less effective. We're going to end up with blood sugar imbalances. It makes our thyroid less effective in thyroid conversion. It also affects sexual hormones. So we have changes in fertility, changes in menstrual cycles, and for men, changes in testosterone levels. So when you think about it, you start to see that the symptoms we experience commonly as humans are all related to the effects of stress.
Yeah, it's so pernicious, and it's in every facet of our lives. And really, this is something that we should pay a lot of attention to, actively pay a lot of attention to, because we brush it off and we're busy and we got to get things done and there's projects and deadlines. And short term, maybe that's okay, but a lot of people live their lives this way. And this is what the world is now, right? There's stress, traffic, deadlines, bosses, kids, lots of things going on, vacations.
And
There's
I would
no,
even
yeah.
consider toxins in our environment as stress. So, like if
Right.
you're exposed to mold toxins or other kinds of environmental toxins, flame retardants, plastics, they also have that similar effect on our systems.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up too. So you actually answered the next question I had for you, which was related to the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal gland axis. And so, from what I understand, is the amygdala in our brain signals the hypothalamus that there's a stressor coming in. So the hypothalamus signals the pituitary, and the pituitary tells the adrenal glands to create cortisol and adrenaline, which are the hormones that are actually affecting all the other systems that we talked about. How does this axis, or the feedback loop, actually get shut off?
And that's the key. If only we could just flip a switch, right? We like need to hit that reset button a lot more often.
Mm-hmm.
And normally there's a inhibitory feedback loop so as the cortisol levels rise in our bloodstream, the receptors in our brain should pick up on that and turn off the HPA axis and say, oh, okay, she's making enough cortisol, we can turn down the volume now. But what happens is when it's this constant stress response, those receptors lose their sensitivity and they don't turn off the stress response as well. And so the stress response keeps going.
And is this what is referred to normally as adrenal fatigue or adrenal distress?
Potentially, and I really think that these term like the term adrenal fatigue is, to me, it's just too vague of a term, because what I see is that it's not the same for everyone. So, and the treatment is different. So if we could say, okay, yes, all of us have adrenal glands that are getting depleted and overtaxed, right? But it's going to look different for everyone. And I think the term adrenal fatigue makes it seem like it's the same for everyone, and it's really not. And so what I like to so the treatment is different. So we need to understand how exactly are your adrenals getting affected by stress, so that we're making sure that we're giving you the right treatment to help them recover. Because this is the thing, is our adrenal glands most cases, the adrenal glands can recover from stress exposure. And for the most part, our bodies in general, our digestion can recover, leaky gut can heal, we can rebalance gut bacteria, we can rebalance hormones. We can do a lot to recover from stress, but we first have to be aware that we're being affected by stress and then get the right treatment to recover.
Yeah, I love that. And you address a lot of this in your book, which we'll talk about shortly, is the different types of stresses that people experience, and then how do you actually deal with them based on different type of stress that you have. And so just a couple or a few more questions about stress, and then we'll get to the protocol and your what you're hypothesizing here with stress, which I love. Okay, so when it's overtaxed, the stress system is overtaxed, the HPA axis is overtaxed, and it just becomes, normally that's how it's functioning, right? When there's a big stressor that comes in, how does your body then react specifically to an additional big stressor that comes in while everything is overtaxed?
Yeah, such a good question. Yeah, I refer to it as we get stuck in stress mode. It's like we're just constantly in this stress response. We don't even know being in or out of it anymore because we're constantly in it. And so then when another stress comes along, the way I would think about it is is just going to trigger more, right? So if your system's already trying to make cortisol and adrenaline as best it can, and then another stress comes along and the adrenal glands just get another surge, another message to try to keep up. And this is when if you think about it, like if you're, it just feels like everything that happens in your life is like, oh, this bad thing happened, and then this bad thing, and then I felt worse, and then this, like it just seems like it's just the stresses are piling one on top of each other, and you start to think to yourself, when do I get a break from this? I remember many times, I learned a lot of this through my own experience with stress, and many times I remember feeling like, how could it possibly get worse? How could I possibly have another stress response? And this is key, I think, is that at that point is where it starts to diverge, where some of our bodies, and this is based on even the stress exposure from our parents and our grandparents, let alone our stress exposure in childhood and throughout our life, and to some degree our genetics related to cortisol and adrenaline production, all comes into play when it comes to answering this question. Why one person, when they're under this one stress after the next, their system goes into high cortisol, high adrenaline, and just gets stuck there. No matter what they're getting exposed to, it's just stuck there. And another person, their adrenal gland production goes to a low cortisol, low adrenaline, for example. That's why I think of it as unique as your fingerprint, because it is so unique what's going to happen to you in that situation.
Yeah, I'd love thinking of it this way. Now, just for the listeners, Dr. Doni, can you please describe what is the levels of cortisol and adrenaline as we go through the day, as we wake up in the morning and as we go through the day? Do these levels rise and fall, or they stay stable? Like how do they progress during the day?
Well, this is the thing. So optimally, we want to have our cortisol increase in the morning. It's actually going to wake us up and give us energy through the day. And it's the only hormone that does that, where it increases in the morning and then gradually decreases through the day. So it's lowest at night when we're going to go to bed. So in some ways, it's a lot to do with our circadian rhythm, along with the melatonin that increases when it gets dark and helps us go to sleep and stay asleep, right? So it's this dance of the cortisol and the melatonin that creates our sort of human experience of awake and sleep. And so that's what I learned from these women in labor way back when I was researching them, is that it was about having an optimal amount of cortisol for that time of day and that experience that they were in. And adrenaline levels stay pretty much the same. You want to kind of have a sort of a constant level of adrenaline throughout the day and the night. So, but you don't want zero, because adrenaline also gives us energy and focus and helps us get a lot of things done. So if we have none, we're going to feel really tired.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Now, you touched on this before, so I want to ask you this question related to genetics and stress. And, many, many years ago, we thought that genetics were our destiny. Soon, we've learned that they're not our destiny, but they still do control 5 to 20% of age-related diseases or problems that you might have in your life. And so, even so, that's a decent number, 5 to 20%, if we take it at that value. So what's the correlation between the stress and your individual genetics?
Yeah, that's the thing is, I mean, well, what I've mostly researched is the genetic variations that have to do with metabolism. So I look at, for example, MTHFR gene variations, COMT, MAO gene variations, and how those can influence our metabolism related to stress. And it's actually very interesting, I find. Like, for example, COMT, a lot of what it does is it metabolizes adrenaline. And some of us, our COMT gene variations cause us to metabolize adrenaline more quickly. So when we have a stress response and adrenaline is produced and our COMT enzyme breaks it down quickly, we actually can have a good response to stress, and then quickly we get rid of that adrenaline. And so in some ways, we might have a good response in the short term, but if we're exposed to long-term stress, then we're more depleted in that situation. Whereas the other possibility is a person who has a COMT that metabolizes more slowly. So now when they have an adrenaline release and production from stress and their body metabolizes it more slowly, their adrenaline stays high for longer. So they might be good at withstanding a longer period of time of stress, but they also might end up finding themselves feeling more adrenalized and stressed even beyond the time that the stress exposure occurred. And so it's, that is so interesting, right? To just see that even the way we metabolize adrenaline is influenced by our genetic variations.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I've looked up my MTHFR, but I've been meaning to look up my COMT for the last couple of months. I haven't gotten around to it. So I assume that this is available in your 23andMe result, or you can export it to some other third-party database.
Exactly. I mean, I usually now use ancestry.com because I find it has a more complete set. And then I've done a lot of my training and work with Dr. Ben Lynch, so I use his Strategene software. It's a complex software report that you get from that, but I'm used to it. Like, to me, I've reviewed it so many times, I can look at it and I see it. I can, you know what I mean? It's one of those things when you've looked at it that many times and studied it, you just can see the patterns right away. And so I love looking at that with patients and helping them. But the key, whenever whenever we're looking at genetics is that we have to know that we could have a gene variation that may not be actually influencing our health at all. And so we always have to compare both the genetic variation with the actual level in our body. So if we want to know about a person's adrenaline, I wouldn't just look at their COMT. I could sort of predict what might happen, but I'm going to then want to measure their actual adrenaline levels so that I can see, oh, is this genetic variation actually causing their adrenaline to be too high or too low? And so I can put all the puzzle pieces together. Ultimately, the way we experience our bodies, our life, and our health is influenced by our genetics and how those genes are playing out based on our stress exposure.
Right. Absolutely right. So you would look into the matrix with the genetic reports, but also correlate that with what's actually happening in the body. So you can see if those SNPs or the genetics or genes are actually being expressed in real time. Awesome. Okay. So let's get into the different stress types that people have, and I have some questions after that too. But there's different, you've outlined 5 types of stress in your book. And so would you please give us an overview of what those 5 types are?
Well, and keep in mind, so I've been measuring patients' cortisol levels at 4 times a day, right? So we talked about how cortisol changes during the day. So we want to measure cortisol in the morning when you first wake up, in the middle of the day, the evening, and bedtime, so that we can see how are you following this? Are you following this optimal cortisol curve, or where is it going too high or too low? I've been measuring patients' cortisol levels for more than 22 years. And
sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Doni. There's no test on the market that does it, right? You have to do this separately in your clinic?
Yeah, it's not going to happen in the regular doctor's office. That's the thing, is a lot of what we're talking about here, or all of what we're talking about, it doesn't happen in the conventional doctor's office under insurance or in the regular labs. That's the thing. Like, a lot of patients who contact me, they're like, my blood work looks normal. My doctor says everything's okay, and even says my adrenal glands are okay, and I don't feel good, right? These are patients who have, fatigue and anxiety and depression and other symptoms, chronic viral infections or digestive issues, or that are autoimmunity. Then they're like, wait a minute, there's got to be something else I can do, even though the standard blood work and the standard physical exam says everything's okay, and it's just due to aging, right? That's what most times they say. It's just because of aging. And I'm here to say, well, let's look a little closer. Now it means, we may need to pay out of pocket for a test to be able to measure more closely and do like that. We do either a saliva test or a urine test at different times a day to measure the cortisol. And then we can measure adrenaline. I highly recommend this, because I found in my research, if we only measure cortisol, we're only getting part of the information. Like, we're then trying to make decisions with half of the information. Why do that? Why we might as well also measure adrenaline levels in the urine, so we can see how the adrenaline is also doing. And I can also then measure the neurotransmitter levels in the urine, like serotonin and GABA and dopamine. And these are specialty tests that are not run in the conventional medical system at this point in time. I think they should be. I believe everyone needs to know this information about their body. It's just that the more we talk about it, hopefully it becomes more mainstream. And so we can, but they don't have to be super expensive. I mean, you can measure a cortisol, adrenaline, and neurotransmitter panel for $350. So it's not like it's $3,000, So we can get this information. You can do it at home. I have patients around the world who work with me, and they can do the test and mail it back, and it's doable. And it usually, we have the results back in a couple of weeks, so we can see where's your cortisol? I always say, what's your cortisol up to? Is it too high? Is it too low at different times of day? And sometimes we like to guess, like, it's tempting. Most people guess their cortisol's too high. But again, based on my research, less than 50% of us have cortisol that's too high. So it's better to test. It's better to really assess it. And so what I found with reviewing all of these test results is that there were 5 common patterns, because this way I could categorize it and I could see the patterns, and then it makes me better as a clinician, because then I can a plan, a protocol based on those patterns. So what I do is I look at, okay, is the cortisol going too high or too low at different times of day? Is the adrenaline going too high or too low? And then we can address their treatment protocol based on that. So the 5 common patterns are: one is a person who has high cortisol and adrenaline at some point or at all day long. That's, I call the stress magnet. Now, a similar pattern would have high cortisol and maybe also high adrenaline, but in the evening and overnight into bedtime, and that's the night owl. So they tend to have their cortisol high in the evening or bedtime. And then the other would be the complete opposite, would be low cortisol, low adrenaline, is blah and blue. And so this is a scenario where the adrenal glands are just, they've been under stress, but they're like, I just can't put out more cortisol and adrenaline. Or it's not that it's zero. It's not that they have Addison's disease, which is a rare condition where the adrenals completely stop working. It's just that the adrenals are under functioning and they're not making enough cortisol and adrenaline to keep up. So that's blah and blue. And then there's 2 other stress patterns that are really common. One is the sluggish and stressed, which has high cortisol matched with a low adrenaline, which sometimes is, you're like, how is that even possible? But sometimes that happens with the adrenal glands. They're still able to make cortisol, but the adrenaline's running low. And then the opposite can be true, which is tired and wired, where they have high adrenaline and low cortisol.
Wow, okay. So you said, surprisingly, you said that less than 50% of your patients have high cortisol levels. I didn't know that was the case. You could have high stress without having high cortisol. So that was interesting to know. But out of these 5 patterns, stress types, which are the most common that you see in your patients?
Yeah, I would say, and it has varied. I actually believe that through the pandemic, it has shifted a bit. And I have to analyze that. I want to go back and analyze that and compare it back, because I'm starting to see a trend here where I think I am seeing more stress magnets where there's more high cortisol, high adrenaline than previous to the pandemic. And so, but I would say the more common is a combination of high cortisol at least one point in the day and low adrenaline.
I see. And what does that manifest as? Are these people, they have low energy and anxiety?
Yeah. And so sometimes patients feel like, how could this even be? How can I be tired and anxious at the same time? You're kind of like, and so you almost feel confused because you're like, this doesn't seem logical. And it's just that the way I look at it is the body's trying to help you keep up with stress. And so it's trying to give you energy to keep up with that stress, but it's actually your body's depleted. And so it's this, you're getting energy from a stressed place instead of energy from a healthy place.
Yeah. Okay, got it. I know that a lot of women, at least, in midlife complain about having low energy, especially in the evenings. And I know thyroid hormones have to do something with that. I advise them to get the full thyroid panel, which most practitioners actually don't do. They just look at TSH. But what is the, I guess, relation of cortisol with thyroid function or thyroid hormones, and how do you see this play out?
Well, part of it is that with the cortisol, either too high or too low, it's going to make the thyroid itself, the function of the thyroid gland, less effective. And also, when we have high stress and high oxidative stress, right? So where we have high oxidative state in our cells and high inflammation in our bodies, we end up decreasing the conversion from T4 to T3. Right. And so a lot of times when the thyroid is under functioning, I would just look at it first as like, oh, wow, the system is overloaded and overwhelmed. And so I really guide my patients when I see that. If I start to see that thyroid function is low, I want to first help make sure we're on a path of helping them to recover from stress. We want to first look at, where's this inflammation and oxidative stress coming from? How are we going to counteract that? How are we going to do some healing of the digestion and decrease toxins in the body, so that the body, and of course we're going to address their cortisol and adrenaline levels, so that the thyroid can start converting better on its own, and this is true also, I find, with MTHFR. I see all the times patients find out they have an MTHFR gene variation, And a lot of practitioners just will say, like with the thyroid, the practitioner just gives thyroid medication, or with
Yeah.
MTHFR, the practitioner just gives a bunch of methylfolate, and it's just not getting at the root cause. It's
Hmm.
not. It's just it's just filling in a quick, temporary way, and maybe even making things worse because it could be overstimulating the body with folate that it can't even use right now, or extra thyroid hormone that it can't use right now. And so what I encourage anyone listening to do instead is to ask why. That's what I do. Is I'm like, why is the thyroid function decreasing? Why is it that this person's body is not using methylfolate effectively? And then when we ask why, that's when we're going to discover, oh, it's the effects of stress. We need to rebalance cortisol, adrenaline, help the gut recover, help the hormones recover, help the metabolism recover. And then all of a sudden, their body starts using the B vitamins better again. And all of a sudden, their thyroid starts working better again. And we didn't even really need to replace those functions.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, if you're going to get on a medication for thyroid, it is a lifelong medication, from what I understand, medication, from what I understand. And so it behooves you to at least figure out if there's root causes, work with a naturopathic practitioner such as yourself to understand if it's something else that's causing the thyroid to underfunction or overfunction in some cases. And if that's a path where we can normally, or I guess without using pharmaceuticals, naturally address this, that'll be the way to go. I completely agreed. And like B vitamins seem to be, in literature and in talking to people, they seem to be protective against stress. And I I know that folate and B12 can be, but are there other B vitamins that are as powerful against stress, or is it just those two, B9 and B12?
I would say all of them. When we talk about the methylation cycle, I call it the B vitamin cycle because it's
Mhm.
really all the B vitamins are involved. We hear most about folate and B12 because those are the methylated B vitamins. But really, for methylation to work, we also need enough B1 and B2 and B3 and B5 and B6. So it's
Okay.
like, I look at it as all these B vitamins have to come together in order to effectively make SAM, which we think of as SAMe in a supplement form, because this SAM is what's doing all this amazing magic in our
Mhm.
bodies, right?
Mhm.
SAM is necessary for making and breaking down neurotransmitters. SAM is necessary for protecting our DNA. It's necessary for producing our genetic functions and genetic expression. It's doing so much good stuff, detoxification in our liver. It's like we're really trying to get to SAM, and to get to SAM we need adequate amounts of all the B vitamins. But I always like to emphasize, and I was thinking about it today, probably one of the main messages that I hope people get from my book is that more is not necessarily better. That just because B vitamins are good for stress doesn't mean that we need to take a whole lot of them. It just means we need to take the right amount
Mhm.
for ourselves as individuals, right? And that's the same thing with exercise. We need the right amount. I need the right amount of exercise for me, and too much is not a good thing. Too little is not a good thing. We can say that about most anything.
Mhm.
From kale to meditation, we need just the right amount.
Yeah, just the right dose. Exactly. The dose makes the poison, right? Okay, so you've got a quiz. So, by the way, folks listening, the five types of stress that we discussed here, Dr. Doni has done a huge service to all of us in that she's gone into great lengths in her book. So, if you get the book, you can read through it. There's the different types of stresses described, and she's got examples of patients that she works with, and also what to do about this, which we'll talk about in a second. But you've got a quiz in your book, Dr. Doni, that allows people to identify what type of stress that they might be having. Could you talk about that quiz for a minute or two?
Yeah, so what I did is based on the research, when I researched and found and identified the stress types, then I went through and looked at what are the symptoms, what does it feel like it to be each of those stress types, and I interviewed patients who were in each of those stress types so that I could develop a quiz so that even if you're not able to do a test for your cortisol and adrenaline levels, you could at least start with the quiz in the book. And we also have that quiz on my website. So you can go through, and based on how you feel, it's based on your energy levels, your mood, your focus, your sleep, and symptoms in your body. We can pretty accurately identify your stress type that way.
And then, of course, there's a plan for how to address and tackle your stress type. So if I was to ask you, for people that are just reading the book and they want to just go through it quickly as a quiz, with a quiz, you can do that. If somebody came to you and you said, okay, we're going to do the full Monty, we're going to go after this, we can do all the tests possible. And we talked about the genetic tests, we talked about MTHFR and some of the COMT and other enzymes and genetic SNPs that people have. We also talked about levels of B vitamins in the body. We also talked about cortisol and adrenaline and 4 different times during the day. Would that be enough to cover and give you a good picture of what's going on in the body, or would you have to do more if you could?
That's a starting place for me. And I also find it's very helpful to assess the degree of leaky gut. And what I find is my best way to assess that is not with because there are some tests out there that are intended to identify leaky gut, and I just haven't found them to be accurate enough. So what I recommend to do is a food sensitivity panel. It's an IgA and IgG. These are delayed antibodies to foods. But you really have to be careful because a lot of labs are just not giving accurate enough information. And I hate for people to invest in a test and then not get the information they really are looking for. So I offer the test that after researching all these different food sensitivity panels, I offer the test that I recommend through my website because I want people to be able to get accurate results and really be able to identify the degree of leaky gut. Again, because most times people think, do I have leaky gut or do I not have leaky gut? But to me, the real question is, how severe is the leaky gut? Because as stressed humans, we all are going to have some degree of leaky gut. We know that all the stresses we've talked about cause leaky gut. So it's more a matter of, is your leaky gut mild, moderate, or severe? And in order to heal leaky gut, it really helps to know which foods are most inflammatory to your body and your digestion. So then you know which foods to avoid. Otherwise, you might be guessing and going around in circles for a long time. So I really find it the IgA, IgG food panel that I recommend is very helpful for stress recovery because it helps us with the gut health recovery. If there's indications that their gut bacteria are out of balance, then I recommend doing a DNA analysis of the gut bacteria so we can really see which bacteria are overgrowing or undergrowing and address them specifically. That's a whole nother area that I love to talk about because I've spent a lot of time running those panels and helping patients and figuring out the most efficient way to get our gut bacteria back on track. So for some patients, that's an important test as well.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. You have developed the C.A.R.E. or C.A.R.E. method of stress recovery. Would you talk about what that all entails?
Yeah, I mean, I write about these foundational aspects of self-care for many years and then realized one day that this fit in the acronym of C.A.R.E. C for clean eating, A for adequate sleep, R for recovery activities, and E for exercise. And these are things that we hear about and know about as things that are good for us. So what I'm saying is, how do we effectively integrate care based on your stress type into your day-to-day routine?
Yeah, and there's a lot of detail. I think Dr. Doni spends a third of her book talking about how to do each of these and how to mix them into a protocol that's right for you. And so I would highly recommend folks get the book. We're all stressed and we need all the tools in our tool belt to deal with this. Okay, now there's not a particular, and I only have one question about the clean eating. I saw that you talked about a few different types of foods and macros, and also Mediterranean diet, but you're not You don't, or do you recommend one diet that's best for most patients, or do you see that it's more individualized?
I really like to give people the room to individualize. And so I look at it as I want to give you the information
Hmm.
that I see as helping most and what I see in the research. And then you can see if there is a particular diet that helps you to follow in your life. So if some people, they might find, oh, thinking about it as a paleo diet really helps me, because then a paleo diet is going to be gluten-free, dairy-free, avoiding sugar, avoiding pesticides, so it's mostly organic, and avoiding other synthetic ingredients, right? So sometimes thinking of it as a paleo diet can be really helpful, because we're already getting pretty clean just by doing that.
Right.
Mediterranean diet, of course, has so much research on it. And so I like to look at that research and say, okay, what is it about a Mediterranean diet that's working?
Mhm.
And to me, what I am thinking is that it has to do with eating whole foods, right, instead of processed foods,
Right.
which is consistent with the paleo diet too, and making sure that we're getting healthy protein sources. I think that there's more awareness for this now, but back when I was training as a nutritionist, this was back in the 90s, it was when it was this whole messaging about going fat free, like eating low fat and emphasizing the carbs. And even back then, I was calculating and I was like, this is not going to work. It's not going to work to try to do this kind of macro eating. And so I, ever since the 90s, have been saying, no, we need to get some healthy fats in our diet. We
Mhm.
absolutely need to make sure we're getting protein with every meal, and whether it's plant-based or not plant-based, because I have patients, some of my patients are plant-based and some of them are not. And I'm not saying you have to choose one or the other. I'm just saying no matter where you get your protein, make sure you get some protein each meal.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, the CARE protocol that we just talked about, clean eating, adequate sleep, recovery, exercise, how does this get personalized for the people that might have high cortisol, low cortisol, and different types of adrenaline in their bodies? How, I know there is some information in the book, but could you talk about how it's personalized?
Yes, and I love this, because what I'm hoping is that more researchers will hear this, and I think we need even more research along these lines,
Hmm.
because I think we deserve to know if certain recovery activities, for example, are better, like for certain stress types, right? So which type of activity, what duration, what time of day would be better for someone who has high cortisol to help bring it down versus someone who has low cortisol and needs to raise it up. And there was some research. So what I did is I went through all the research and I presented in the book, here's what I could see. And some of the main things that are currently in the research has to do with understanding sometimes if we overdo the things that are good for us, it can actually raise our cortisol. So if we do overdo exercise, like if we either do too intense exercise for too long, we end up raising our cortisol levels. And so someone who already has high cortisol,
Hmm.
and they could actually make it worse by exercising too much. And this, it also could be true for someone who's an athlete, where really their profession requires that they exercise for long duration. So then they need to be making sure that they are helping to counteract that high cortisol effect in order to not have their athleticism negatively affect their health and their performance. Another example would be when say someone's trying out intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting, we know that there's definitely some benefits to having some time where we're not eating overnight, which most of us are sleeping anyway, so we get some amount of intermittent fasting. But what we also know from the research is if I as an individual extend my fast too long, I can actually raise my cortisol levels. And now, again, I'm working against myself by pushing my cortisol too high just by trying to do something that I thought was good for me. And so that's one of the main things I was able to really see in the research is, again, this too much of a good thing, and I really encourage people to reflect on, if you for yourself, hey, am I thinking that I'm doing something good for myself, like exercising or intermittent fasting, but I'm ending up disrupting my cortisol levels in the process, and how do I rethink this? How do I pull back a little bit? And this is the thing, is when we're in the midst of stress recovery, we're already needing to pull back a little bit, right? Because we've learned, usually from many cultures across the world, we learn to push ourselves more, right? We're like, oh, I'm supposed to be able to withstand stress. I'm supposed to be able to go do a longer workout or a harder workout. I'm supposed to be able to, do it more and better.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're saying, oh my gosh, wait a minute, to do less feels like we're failing ourselves and failing others, and we sometimes need to visit that, and reconsider that. Is it actually that I'm giving up, or is it that I'm actually just making sure that I'm not pushing myself too hard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great examples. Dr. Doni, we're coming up on time, so I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. Are you seeing patients? I know you're based in Long Island, so are you seeing patients only in New York State or across the country?
I see patients around the world.
Fantastic.
Yeah, 90% of my patients are by phone and Zoom from around the world. So yeah, I'm located in New York, and I do see patients in person here, but I help patients wherever they are.
Mm-hmm. Because it's a matter of getting tests. They can do the test from anywhere. And then that's just a report that they can forward to you in an email. And then you can take a look at that and have a Zoom conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Exactly.
straightforward. Where can people find you, your website, your social media handles? Please tell us everything.
DrDoni.com. Doni is actually short for Donielle, and so it's spelled Doni, and you can find me at Doni Wilson on Instagram and social media. You can find my website at DoctorDoni.com, and that's where you'll find my blog and my podcast and other interviews like this. I can't wait to post this one there.
Fantastic. And then the way to get a hold of you is on the website too, if they don't go to Instagram?
Yes.
Okay. Great, Dr. Doni. Thank you so much for coming to the Anti-Aging Hacks Show. Really appreciate this great conversation about stress and a lot of detail into it, which we're not able to get in the podcast because it's going to take hours, literally. I've been reading your book and I'm surprised at a lot of the information that I'm learning. So thank you for doing the good work, and I hope to see you soon and shake your hand.
Thank you. I look forward to that too.